The package was late, and Darren Voss didn't care. He'd stopped caring about a lot of things in the 18 months since the Kethsolari Compact had folded the old interstellar freight union into its labor pool. He still showed up. He still loaded the crates onto the mag sled and ran the prescribed routes through the lower tiers of Solaris Station, a city that floated in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant so massive that its gravity made the soles of your boots feel like they were full of wet sand at the end of every shift. He still made the deliveries on time mostly. He just didn't care. The habit had started 6 months ago, somewhere between his second demotion and his first eviction warning. He would pick up whatever small object was nearest, a hex bolt, a cracked valve coupling, a spare link from his sled's chain drive, and toss it from hand to hand while he waited for the loading dock doors to cycle. It wasn't something he decided to do. It was something his hands did while the rest of him stood there calculating how much longer he could make 3 days' rations last. Today it was a triangular fastener from a cargo manifest he'd already filed. It arced up, caught the light from the bioluminescent ceiling panels, came back down. He caught it without looking. The dock super, a big Kethsolari labor coordinator named Preth, watched him from the upper rail with the particular expression that meant Preth found humans unsettling when they did things that served no visible function. Darren kept tossing the fastener. Voss, Bay 14, medical consumables for the Spire district. He tucked the fastener in his chest pocket and went to Bay 14. The Spire district was upper tier. Upper tier meant the mag sled's route would take him through the transition viaduct, which was where Kethsolari admin personnel rode mag rails between the working levels and the floating residential towers above. Darren had run the transition viaduct twice in his 18 months on station, and both times he'd been nervous the whole way, the way you got nervous when you were wearing dirty clothes in a room full of people who smelled like engineered flowers. The Kethsolari didn't smell like flowers. They didn't smell like anything humans could process, but the principle was the same. He loaded the medical pallet, ran the manifest check, locked the sled's cargo rails, and started up the service ramp. He almost didn't notice the crate. It was wedged in the gap between the access corridor wall and a support stanchion, small enough that it would have been invisible to anyone who wasn't exactly Darren's height, crouching at exactly the angle he crouched at when he tied his left boot, which had a tension clasp that never quite held at the heel. He only saw it because of the clasp. He retied it, straightened up, and there it was. A matte gray container, no bigger than a hardback book, stamped with Kethsolari freight codes he didn't recognize. The codes were in a script that looked older than the standard commercial fonts, angular, deliberate strokes that seemed almost architectural. He should have reported it. He picked it up instead. The weight was wrong. It was too heavy for its size, and when he tilted it slightly he felt something shift inside, not a loose object but a distributed shift, like the weight of the thing was moving through fluid. He turned it over. On the bottom face, partially obscured by a scuff of gray warehouse dust, was a different mark. Not Kethsolari commercial. Not any freight designation he'd seen in 18 months of running these corridors. It looked like a name, or what a name would look like if names were made of geometry. He put it in his jacket's interior pocket, which was technically large enough and technically against about 8 regulations, and kept walking. The medical delivery went fine. He logged the signature, handed over the pallet, rode the service lift back toward lower tier. He didn't touch the crate in his pocket during the descent. He didn't touch it until he was back in his bunk, in the crew dormitory on sub-level 9, which he shared with 11 other humans and 2 Thurvian contract laborers named Os and Pelek. Os and Pelek were playing a card game that involved a lot of deliberate silence and occasional eye contact challenges. The other humans were either asleep or performing the variety of maintenance tasks people did on their bodies when they'd been working all day and couldn't afford anything better. Retaping blistered thumbs, soaking feet, eating supplement bars with the mechanical focus of someone who was very hungry and very tired. Darren sat on his bunk and opened the crate. Inside, nested in a material that was not foam and not gel but something between them, was a sphere about the size of a fist. It was dark, not matte dark but deep dark, the dark of space viewed from outside an atmosphere, except that it wasn't uniformly dark. When he tilted it, light moved inside it, not reflected light, interior light. Small, slow pulses, the way bioluminescent creatures pulsed in deep ocean footage he'd watched as a kid on Earth. He turned it in his fingers. The pulses changed. That was the first time he felt it, not heard it, felt it, the way you felt the sub-bass of a large engine through the soles of your feet. A resonance that started in his fingertips and moved up into his jaw and behind his eyes. Not unpleasant, not painful. More like the feeling of a word on the tip of your tongue when you can't remember the word, except the feeling was moving in the opposite direction, like the word was coming to you from somewhere outside your skull. He was still sitting there 15 minutes later when Os paused the card game and looked over. "You found a resonance key," Os said. Os's translator implant gave all his speech the same mild, observational tone, which meant Darren couldn't tell if this was an observation or an alarm. "I don't know what I found." "That's a Veth Karen resonance key." Os put his cards down. Pelek also put his cards down, which felt significant. "You need to put that back." "I don't know where it came from." "It came from the Veth Karen. Humans don't have those." "Where did you find it?" Darren told him about the access corridor. Os and Pelek exchanged a look that his translator implant could only partially decode, something in the tonal harmonics that the implant flagged as *significant shared knowledge/unresolved concern. "The Veth Karen are the Kethsolari's administrators," Pelek said. It was the most Darren had ever heard Pelek say. "The Kethsolari built this station. The Veth Karen built the Kethsolari." "What does that mean?" "It means," Os said carefully, "that you are holding something very old and you should not be holding it." Darren looked at the sphere. The light inside it pulsed, and something moved behind his teeth, not a sound but the shape of a sound, the outline of a phoneme, the ghost of a syllable from a language he had never learned. He put the sphere in the crate, put the crate under his bunk, and didn't sleep for 4 hours. In the morning, he ran his deliveries. He ran them the same way he always ran them, with the same sled on the same routes, through the same corridors that smelled of coolant and recycled atmosphere, and the mineral undertone of the station's structure, which was made of something the Kethsolari had engineered from the gas giant's upper atmospheric compounds, and which had a smell like very old stone that had been wet and dried too many times. He ran the route precisely. He was efficient. He did not think about the sphere. He thought about the sphere. It occurred to him, around midday, climbing a service ramp with a pallet of filtration components, that he had not been frightened last night. He had been unsettled, which was different. Frightened was the feeling he'd had 18 months ago when the compact had sent a representative to the workers' assembly and explained, with enormous courtesy, that the freight union's charter was being dissolved and that all human workers would be reassigned to compact-managed labor contracts. The representative had used the word reassigned 9 times. Each time, Darren had felt the specific fear that comes from understanding you are in a system that is much larger than you, that runs on logic you were not designed to operate, and that your position in it is defined entirely by what you can carry from one place to another. The sphere had not felt like that. It had felt like recognition, the way a pattern of symbols in a manual suddenly resolved into sense, the way a mechanism you'd been looking at for an hour finally showed you its working principle, and you understood that it had always been showing you, and you had just been looking at it wrong. He picked up the fastener from his pocket and tossed it, caught it, without thinking. A Kethsolari overseer passing in the other direction slowed, watched the motion of the fastener, and then continued on. Darren watched the overseer's departure in his peripheral vision. There was something in the way the overseer had paused, not curiosity exactly. Something colder. He put the fastener away. There was a woman in the sub-level 9 dormitory named Camille Restrepo, who had been on Solaris Station for 4 years, which was 3 years longer than almost any other human worker. She had been there long enough that she knew things. Not things from data systems, not things from the formal documentation that compact management released to the labor pool. Things from watching. Darren found her in the dormitory's maintenance alcove. She spent her off hours there because it was the only private space on sub-level 9, being too small for most activities and too noisy from the ductwork for comfortable sleep, doing what she was often doing, which was writing in a small physical notebook. He'd never seen a human carry a physical notebook before Camille. She said it was because nothing written in it could be network accessed. Vethkaran resonance key, he said. She looked up. Where? He told her. She closed the notebook. Did you touch it? Yes. Did it respond? He described the pulsing, the shift in light, the resonance behind his teeth. She was quiet for a moment. You know what the Vethkaran are? Os told me, administrators. The ones above the Kethsolari. That's a simplified version. She set the notebook on the ductwork pipe that served as her shelf. The Vethkaran are old. I don't mean old the way the Kethsolari are old. They have civilization records going back maybe 900 years, which feels long from our perspective but isn't. The Vethkaran are old the way the universe is old. Nobody knows exactly. The Kethsolari don't know exactly, and the Kethsolari built this entire station to specifications that the Vethkaran gave them. The Spire District, the towers in the upper tier, where nobody below management level ever goes, that's where the Vethkaran residential zone is. Nobody who works down here has ever been up there. What's in the Spire District? Records, Camille said. That's the word that moves through the station. Records. The Vethkaran carry their history in physical archive, not data systems, actual physical objects. Libraries of them, the kind you can only read if you know the language, except the language is old enough that most of the Kethsolari can't read it either. There are supposedly only a handful of Vethkaran still alive who can. She looked at him steadily. A resonance key is an access object. It encodes language, not just vocabulary and grammar, but the whole phonological and semantic framework. You're not supposed to be able to feel it unless you're already capable of processing it, which only happens if you have the right cognitive architecture. I'm a delivery worker. I know what you are. She said it without condescension, just as a fact. I'm telling you what the resonance key is. The implication is yours to work out. He worked it out on the way back to his bunk. He worked it out while he lay on his back staring at the dormitory ceiling with the crate under his bunk and the soft, deep pulse of the sphere moving through the metal floor and into his spine. The implication was, somehow, for some reason that had nothing to do with his choice or his background or his status as a reassigned labor contract in compact sub-level 9, he could feel a language that was old enough that most of the aliens who built this station couldn't feel it anymore. He did not know what to do with that. He fell asleep with the fastener in his hand, tossing it up an inch and catching it, tossing it up, catching it, until his arm relaxed and it rolled onto the bunk beside him. 3 days later, 2 Kethsolari security officers came to the dormitory. They were looking for a missing freight item. A container, approximately this size, recovered from a service corridor. Had any workers found such an item? The question was directed at the room, but the eyes, which on Kethsolari operated through a lateral array of sensory pits, rather than the binocular forward-facing arrangement of human faces, moved over the human bunks with the specificity of a systematic search. Darren was at work. Os was at work. Pelek was in the dormitory, and Darren heard later that Pelek had said nothing, had played his card game, had met none of the sensory pits. When Darren came back that evening, Pelek told him he had maybe a day. "They're doing a log search," Pelek said. "Your route, your corridor transit logs, it will take them less than one cycle to correlate." "What happens then?" Pelek considered. "Your contract is terminated. You are processed for departure." "Departure to where?" "Off station." Darren sat down. Off station from Solaris meant a transport back to the compact's intake facility at Chandler Point, which was 3 months' travel and which, in compact terminology, meant the labor contract was voided. Which in human terminology meant you had no money, no station credits, no return ticket to anywhere because there was nowhere to return to. Earth's own labor migration program had provided the one-way passage as part of the employment agreement, and the employment agreement did not provide for return. "There has to be something else," he said. "You could return it," Pelek said, "to the Spire District." "Workers don't go to the Spire District." "No," Pelek agreed, "they don't." Oz was looking at him with the expression his translator implant could now, after enough exposure, begin to parse. The expression that meant I have information that I am choosing to share, because I have decided you are in enough trouble that the information cannot make things significantly worse. "There are access restrictions on the Spire District elevators," Oz said. "There are service routes that bypass the restrictions, routes the original station engineers built in for maintenance. Not for workers, for maintenance. I know 2 of them." "Why?" "Because I have been here longer than you and I learned what I could learn." He glanced at Pelek. "We have both been here longer than you." Darren pulled the crate from under his bunk, opened it, and looked at the sphere. The light inside it moved in its slow, deep way. The resonance started in his fingertips before he'd even picked it up. "Show me the route," he said. They went at the shift change, when the transit logs were in their 2-minute reconciliation window. Oz knew every dead zone in the sub-level 9 corridor monitoring, which turned out to be more dead zones than Darren had guessed, accumulated through years of maintenance cycles that didn't quite line up with the monitoring upgrade schedules. They moved through the lower corridors in single file, Darren with the crate in his jacket, Camille because she had decided she was coming, and no one had found a compelling argument otherwise, and Oz and Pelek because, as Oz put it, they had nowhere better to be and had been waiting 4 years for something to do that was not loading or unloading things. The maintenance route to the Spire District ran through the station's structural utility spine, a set of conduits designed for engineering access to the support columns. The conduits were not pressurized for comfortable habitation. They were pressurized for equipment and the occasional maintenance drone, which meant the ceilings were low, the air tasted of machine oil and ozone, and the lighting was purely functional. Bare strips every 3 meters, casting everything in alternating bright bands and hard shadow. Darren went first. He had the sphere's resonance to navigate by. That was the thing he had not told Oz or Pelek, because he hadn't been sure how to say it. The sphere was directional. When he held it and moved, he could feel a gradient in the resonance, a quality of it that was stronger in certain directions and weaker in others, the way a sound was louder when you faced its source. He had no idea if this was the sphere's function or an artifact of his strange ability to feel it. He moved through the maintenance conduits by feel, by the pull of the resonance, and tried not to think too hard about what that meant. Camille stayed close behind him. He heard her breathing, steady and deliberate, the breathing of someone managing their own adrenaline rather than being managed by it. Behind her, Oz moved with the practiced quiet of a long-term worker who had learned to be invisible. Pelek made no sound at all. They climbed 2 access ladders, crossed a horizontal conduit so narrow they went single file with their arms above their heads, descended a service drop that was meant to be used by maintenance drones and which, for humans, required pressing your back against one wall and your boots against the other, and praying neither surface was recently re-greased. Then the conduit widened, the ceiling lifted, and the air changed. The air in the Spire District Maintenance Corridor smelled different from anywhere else on the station. It smelled like old paper and something electric, and beneath both of those, something mineral that Darren couldn't identify, but that made the sphere in his jacket pulse stronger, faster. "We're here," he said. The Spire District was not what he'd expected. He had expected something sterile, administrative, the way the compact's upper management areas always looked: clean surfaces, directional lighting, the aesthetic of a species that had decided efficiency was a form of beauty. What he found, stepping out of the maintenance conduit into a utility anteroom, was the opposite. Every surface was covered. Not in the way walls got covered in lived-in spaces, with personal objects and makeshift additions. In the way ancient buildings got covered, the walls themselves bearing marks, inscriptions, glyphs, the same angular architectural script he'd seen on the crate. Floor to ceiling, both sides continuous, not graffiti, not random. The marks had the quality of text, the quality of language that had been arranged and rearranged and refined over a very long time, until it occupied exactly the right space, and said exactly the right things with exactly the right visual weight. He ran his hand along the wall, and the sphere went entirely bright. Not pulsing, lit, a constant warm glow that came through the fabric of his jacket and cast his shadow sharp and clear against the inscribed wall behind him. "What is it doing?" Camille said. "I don't know." But he was already reading. That was the only word for it. His eyes moved across the inscriptions and his brain was doing something to them. Not translating exactly, not the way a translation worked, word by mapped word. More like his mind was finding the resonance of each mark the way your ear found the note of a sound before you'd consciously identified it. He understood that this inscription described the station's original construction. He understood that section. He moved along the wall. He understood that section too, which was about something older, a transfer of knowledge from the Veth Karen to the Keth Solari, a compact. He understood that word, that was what the station was named after, and the compact had terms, and one of the terms was. A door opened. The being that stepped through it was taller than Darren by about a meter, narrower than any Keth Solari, and clothed in something that was not fabric but moved like it. A structured material that shifted slowly at the edges, like heat shimmer. Its face, if face was the right word, was a vertical plane of faintly iridescent surface that arranged itself differently as it looked at him. Behind it, the room from which it had come was full of shelves, and the shelves were full of physical objects, and the objects were all the same size and shape as the inscribed panels on this corridor's walls, except they glowed from within, and the glow was the same color as the sphere in his jacket. The being made a sound. His translator implant rendered it as unrecognized/insufficient data. But Darren understood it. It was a question, and the question was, how are you reading that? He answered in English, because English was all he had, and then something happened that he hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted. The sphere in his jacket pulsed, one clean pulse, and the air between him and the being vibrated with a set of sounds that were not English and were not the being's language but were something else, something older and between them, and the being went very still. Then it said something else. His implant said asterisk unrecognized again, but he understood. You are speaking the founding language. I don't know how, he said, and the sphere translated it again, and the being made a gesture with one of its lateral appendages that his human brain wanted to read as uncertainty, or wonder, or possibly both. His name in the founding language, he understood suddenly, was not Darren. His name in the founding language was a resonance pattern that described someone who moves between places carrying things of value, which was a description and also an identity, which was different from a name but in the founding language was the same thing. He opened his mouth and said it, and it came out right, and behind him he heard Camille make a sound he had never heard her make, which was a sharp intake of breath. What, she said, was that? He couldn't explain it. He turned to the being instead. He had come to return the sphere and explain how he'd found it, so he started there, in English and in the translated pulses, and the being listened, its surface rearranging itself in patterns he was beginning to read as attention, concentration, reaction. When he finished, the being made a long statement. The sphere translated it in pieces, and some of the pieces he understood and some he didn't, but the core of it was this. The resonance key had not been lost. It had been placed. There were Veth-Karen records. This was the word records. The word Camille had said, describing a frequency in human cognitive architecture that matched the founding language's resonance parameters. The Veth-Karen had known about it for some time. What they had not done, and what the Compact's administration had not done, and what nobody had done, was tell the humans. The humans had been here for 18 months as labor. The humans could, apparently, read the oldest language in this sector of space. Nobody had mentioned it. He should have gone back. That was the logical thing. Take the information, return to sub-level 9, figure out what it meant from a position of relative safety, relative being the key word, since there was no fully safe position for a labor contract worker who'd been in the Spire district after hours with a stolen artifact. But the being, his translator implant, working now at the edge of its capacity, gave him the word *archivist*, with a capital letter, which suggested the implant recognized this as a title. The archivist had not called security. The archivist had taken the sphere, turned it over in its appendages, looked at Darren, and asked a question. The question which took the sphere 3 pulses to translate. Will you stay and help us read? He did not give an immediate answer. He turned to his companions. Camille was looking at the walls of the corridor with her notebook open and her pen moving. She had been writing constantly since the sphere first lit, her hand moving without her appearing to look at it, which meant she was reading the walls the way he was reading them, which meant whatever capacity he had, she had it too, or some version of it. Os and Pelek were standing at the doorway to the archive room, looking in at the shelves of glowing panels. Pelek, who had said perhaps 30 words in Darren's entire time on station, was whispering something that Darren couldn't hear, but that Os was listening to with the posture of someone hearing something important. The founding language, Darren was beginning to understand, had more speakers than anyone had counted. What does it mean, he said to the archivist, that we can read this? The sphere took a moment. Then, it means you were here before. Not here on this station. He understood the scale of the statement here in this part of space among these civilizations, in the chain of things that got built and forgot themselves and got rebuilt again. Humans had been, at some point long enough ago that no human record held it, part of something that used this language. Not visitors, not newcomers, something older. The compact that had given this station its name, the compact described on this wall that he'd been reading, had human signatories. The marks he'd taken for decorative elements, the marks that didn't look architectural, were names. Human names, written in a way that made them resonance patterns instead of sounds. One of them was his. Not his name. The resonance pattern that described his function, the carrier, the one who moves things between places. It was in the founding compact's record of participants. It was a role that had been here before him and would be here after him, but it was his role, and he was wearing it. He looked at the archivist. "I'll stay," he said. "For now, we'll figure out the rest." The sphere translated it. The archivist's surface rearranged into something his brain mapped as relief, which surprised him, until he thought about how long the archivist must have been waiting for someone to help carry something that had gotten very, very heavy. The trouble arrived at approximately 2 in the morning, station time. It came in the form of 3 Kethsolari security officers with access overrides and a directive from Compact Administration. He learned this later in pieces, the way you reconstructed events from the evidence they left. At the time, he was aware only that the door at the far end of the archive corridor opened without the archivist opening it, and that the officers came through with the efficient, unhurried movement of people who did not expect resistance, because, in their experience, resistance from sub-level laborers was not a variable they needed to account for. They were used to workers who understood their position. The first officer reached for the shelf nearest the door, where 3 of the archive panels were stacked, panels that Camille had been reading, and that apparently Compact Administration had decided needed to be inventoried, or removed, or controlled in some way that the directive didn't bother to specify. Camille stepped between the officer and the shelf. She said, in the flat, clear voice she used when she had decided something, "Those aren't Compact property." The officer's translator implant rendered this in Kethsolari, and the officer responded with something that Darren's implant gave him as, "Your labor contract is suspended pending disciplinary review." Then the officer moved her aside, not roughly, with the impersonal efficiency of someone moving a piece of furniture. Camille looked at Darren. He looked at the corridor around him. He had been in this maintenance conduit system for 5 hours. In that time, he had learned its shape the way he learned routes, the dead ends, the widths, the clearances, the way sound carried and where it didn't. He knew where the archive room's secondary access was. He knew the conduit above the officer's head had a junction point 20 meters back that accessed the station's structural support grid. He knew what the archive panels weighed. He also knew what was in his chest pocket. The fastener, the triangular one that he'd been tossing since he couldn't remember when. He took it out. Tossed it up, caught it. The officer's sensory array tracked the motion. All 3 officers tracked it, because the Kethsolari lateral sensor system was optimized for exactly this kind of small, fast, directional movement. All 3 of them were looking at his hand. He caught the fastener and threw it, hard, at the junction point above the corridor, hitting the emergency release for the structural grid's maintenance access hatch. The hatch dropped 2 meters of conduit scaffolding into the corridor between him and the officers, and the clang of it was enormous in the enclosed space. And while all 3 officers adjusted their sensor arrays and moved toward the obstruction with their tools out, Os was already through the archive room's secondary access door with 2 panels under each arm, and Pelek had the shelf brackets released with the efficiency of someone who had spent years releasing brackets in low-light conditions. And Camille had her notebook out and was moving. Darren went to the archivist. The archivist had not moved during any of this. It stood in the archive room center with the sphere, his sphere, the one he'd found held in both appendages, and its surface was cycling through patterns he had not seen before, patterns that his brain read not as recognizable emotions but as something older, conflict between protocols. The archivist was an administrator of records, not a being designed for the choice it was being asked to make. He understood that. He said in English and in the translated pulse of the sphere, "You don't have to choose right now. You just have to decide if these belong to the people who made them or to the people who found them." The sphere took a long time with that one. Then the archivist tucked the sphere into its own garment and moved toward the secondary access with a speed that did not match its apparent leisure. The route back through the maintenance conduits was faster than the route in. Fear did that. They moved through the structural utility spine with the archive panels distributed between them. Os and Pelek had 10 between them, which was not physically sustainable but which they sustained, because Thurvians, as Darren was learning, had a quiet competitive relationship with what was physically sustainable and had been operating at its edge for their entire time on station. Camille had 2 panels in her notebook. Darren had 3 panels and the crate, which he'd recovered from the access anteroom on his way through. The officers had not followed through the secondary access. They were, according to what Oz said later, waiting for clearance to enter the maintenance conduits, because the maintenance conduits were a gray zone in the compact's access documentation, and Keth Solari security operated on explicit authorization rather than implied authority. It was a hole in the system, the kind of hole that opened up when a system was designed by one kind of mind and occupied by several other kinds. They came out of the conduit on sub-level 9, with 20 minutes left before the shift monitoring logs reconciled. Darren handed the archive panels to Camille, who had places for them. He didn't ask where, and she didn't say, because in her 4 years she had arranged for things to exist in places that monitoring logs didn't cover, and this was not the time for explanation. Oz and Pellic went to their bunks. The card game was still laid out. They sat down and dealt. Darren sat on his bunk with the empty crate in his lap. Then he pulled the fastener from his pocket and held it still for once without tossing it. Just held it, turning it between his fingers. Triangular, 3 equal sides, an object that balanced perfectly when you put it on any of its faces. Camille sat down across from him. She had her notebook. She opened it to the pages she'd filled in the Spire District corridor, tight handwriting, every page, both sides. "How much do you actually understand of it?" she said. "Be precise." He thought about it. Enough to know the compact has been violated. The Keth Solari Compact, the actual founding document, has provisions for cognitive linguistic rights of all signatory species. Humans are in that document. If humans are in that document, then the labor contract that dissolved the freight union violates the founding compact, because you can't absorb the labor of a signatory species without their ratified consent. He paused. That's what's in the records, isn't it? That's what the compact's administration wants to control. Camille looked at him for a moment. "I've been trying to figure it out for 4 years. What the records said that they didn't want anyone to know." She closed the notebook. "How are you going to prove it?" The archivist. The archivist is Veth Karen administration. They're part of the structure. "They brought the sphere to the lower corridors," Darren said. "It wasn't lost. It was placed." He thought about the being's expression when he'd arrived, not surprise exactly, but the relief of someone whose wait had ended. "I think the archivist has been waiting for a long time for someone to come up there and read what's written on those walls. I think the compact knew humans could read the founding language and decided to keep humans in the labor pool instead. And I think the archivist decided to do something about it." "You're describing an alien bureaucrat who committed sedition on behalf of people they'd never met." "I'm describing someone who was carrying something too heavy alone and found a way to share the load." He tossed the fastener up, caught it. "We do deliveries. That's the job. Things move from where they are to where they need to be. This needs to move." What happened next took time. Real time, the grinding, document-intensive, procedural kind that doesn't make for good storytelling, but is the mechanism by which actual things change. Darren would have lied if he said there were no nights when he sat in the sub-level dormitory and wondered if all of it had been a very elaborate nothing. A sphere that glowed, a wall he thought he could read, a grand pattern that was actually just the pattern his own mind had imposed on noise. But Camille had 4 years of documentation and a network of contacts across 8 species labor organizations that she had been building quietly, with the kind of patience that came from understanding that the right time was not yet, and then watching very carefully for when it was. The archivist communicated through channels that didn't exist in the compact's official documentation. This turned out to be normal for the Veth Karen. They had built the compact, and they had built access paths into it that the Keth Solari didn't know about, the way an architect keeps an unlogged door in every building they design, not for secrecy, but because the design requires it, and sometimes the design is more important than the security layer applied over it. The founding compact's provisions for signatory species were real. The records proved it. The archivist provided attestation. Camille's documentation of the labor conditions, cross-referenced with the compact's provisions, made a case that 12 of the 14 species on the station's intersystem labor board agreed was worth reviewing. The Quetzalari administration asked for a delay, then another, then a third. The third delay request was filed while Darren was on his regular delivery route, running filtration components up the transition viaduct, which he still ran the same way as always, with the fastener in his pocket, tossing it from hand to hand. He was on the viaduct when the archivist's notification came through, not through the network, not through any official channel, but through the sphere, which Darren was no longer carrying but which he could still feel faintly, the way you still feel a tool in your hand after you've put it down. A pulse, a frequency, a word in the founding language that his translator implant rendered as asterisk unrecognized but that he understood without the implant. Done. He caught the fastener and held it. The viaduct stretched ahead of him, the clean upper-level air moving through it with the faint blue light of the bioluminescent panels, and above the viaduct's far end, through the transparasteel panels that separated the working levels from the spire district towers, he could see the floating structures of the upper city. He had spent 18 months knowing they were there and not looking at them. He looked at them now. They were beautiful was the thing. He had not expected that. The towers moved in slow rotation relative to the station's main body, and the light caught their faces at different angles as they moved, and the material they were made of, the same material as the inscribed walls, held and reflected, and transformed the light into something that was not quite any color he had a name for, but that he understood, the way he understood the founding language, as the visual equivalent of something very old saying. We were here and here and here, and this is what it looked like asterisk. He put the fastener in his pocket, picked up the sled's handle, delivered the filtration components. The hearing was held in a chamber that none of the human workers had been in before, and all of them were there. Every human on Solaris Station's labor manifest, 43 people in a room designed for species whose spatial requirements were different. So the humans stood close together, shoulder to shoulder, which was uncomfortable and also, as Darren thought about it later, probably the right arrangement. The way soldiers stood in formations not because standing close increased their effectiveness, but because it reminded them they were part of something. Camille presented the documentation. She had been preparing for 4 years and she presented for 37 minutes, and she did not look at her notes once. Os and Pelek provided attestation of conditions. 3 representatives from the Intersystem Labor Board asked questions. The Quetzalari administration's representatives sat at the far end of the chamber, with the particular stillness of people who have already run their calculations, and know what the outcome is, and are now waiting for the process to complete. The archivist appeared via projection, which was the Veth-Karen method for formal attestation. Its surface cycled through patterns that Darren could now read well enough to know it was experiencing something like satisfaction, the satisfaction of a very long-held thing finally being set down. It provided the founding language attestation directly, in the founding language, without translation, which technically required a qualified speaker to confirm. The hearing coordinator, a Thurvian legal representative named L, who Darren had never met but who Pelek apparently knew, looked at the board and said, "The attestation is in the founding language. Does anyone here speak it?" He hadn't planned to speak. He had planned to stand in the back with the other 42 humans and let the process run. But the room was quiet, and the archivist's projection was looking at him with the specific attention of someone waiting for a thing they have set in motion to complete its arc, and the fastener in his pocket was a weight he knew exactly, having carried it so long. He said, "I do." He walked to the front of the chamber. He stood under the archivist's projection. He looked at the document the legal representative had displayed, the founding compact, in the original founding language, the text he had been reading off corridor walls for 2 months in stolen minutes, familiar now the way a route became familiar, every mark in its right place. He read the relevant provisions aloud. His voice, in the founding language, was different from his voice in English. Not different in quality or tone, but different in the way you were different when you spoke a language you'd grown up with versus a language you'd learned. Except this was not a language he'd learned, and not a language he'd grown up with. It was something older, something carried in whatever part of human cognition the Veth-Karen researchers had noted in their records, and the Kethsolari administration had decided not to mention. He spoke it without hesitation and understood every word of what he said, and the 42 humans behind him were quiet in the way that rooms got quiet when something real was happening. The hearing coordinator made a notation. The labor board conferred for 9 minutes. The Kethsolari administration's representatives had already gathered their materials and were moving toward the exit when the decision was announced, which was not an acknowledgement of guilt. The documentation didn't support that, and the legal mechanisms of the compact didn't allow for that finding at this stage, but was a mandate for renegotiation. The freight union was not reinstated. The labor contracts were not voided. But they were required to be reviewed under the signatory provisions of the founding compact, and a human representative was required to be present for that review, and the review had a deadline, and the deadline had enforcement mechanisms, and the enforcement mechanisms had the archivist's formal attestation behind them, which meant they had 9,000 years of Veth-Karen record-keeping behind them, which was not nothing. It was not everything. Darren knew that. Camille had said it before the hearing. This is not the end of the thing. This is the beginning of the thing that might end it, eventually, if every step after this is also taken. He understood that. After the hearing, on the transition viaduct on his regular route, he took the fastener out of his pocket. He looked at it. A triangular piece of hardware he'd picked up from a filed manifest on a day he'd been thinking about how much longer he could make 3 days' rations last. He'd been carrying it for most of his time on this station. He didn't know why exactly, except that his hands had needed something to do while the rest of him figured out what to do, and a thing that could be tossed and caught had been enough. He tossed it up, caught it. Down the viaduct where the service access connected to the sub-level 9 corridors, Camille was waiting. She had her notebook. She was writing something. She looked up when she heard him coming, and he could see she had already moved on to the next thing, already was planning the next step, which was how she was built and why she was the right person for it. Behind her, Os and Pelek were sharing something from a container that was technically a personal food item, and technically not subject to labor contract restrictions. And they were doing the thing with their eyes that, in Thurvian communication, meant this day is different from other days. He caught the fastener a last time and held it. He thought about the corridor wall, and the name inscribed on it, the resonance pattern for the one who carries things between places, and how long it had been waiting there for someone to read it. He thought about the archivist, carrying the records alone in the Spire district until it found a way to let one of the records go, to let it find its way down to the levels where it might land in the hands of someone who could feel it. He thought about the sphere pulsing in the dark, patient as anything, waiting. He put the fastener in his pocket. He went to his friends. Through the transparent steel panels of the viaduct, the Spire district towers rotated slowly in their light, neither closer nor further than they'd ever been, but different now. Different the way anything was different when you had a name for it, when you understood what it had always been saying. He didn't look at them for long. There was a route to run and a delivery to make, and after that, a meeting Camille had scheduled with the Labor Board's procedural office, which would be long and grinding, and exactly the kind of work that changed things. He was good at carrying things. He was good at knowing which way to go. He went. The renegotiation took 4 months. Darren ran his routes through all 4 of them. He wasn't the lead on the Labor Board proceedings. Camille was, And he wasn't the documentation specialist or the legal researcher or the intersystem communication coordinator, which were roles filled by people better suited to them. What he was the founding language speaker, which turned out to be a role required in very specific moments. When the board needed attestation of a record's authenticity, when a Veth-Karen communication arrived that no standard translator could parse, when the Keth-Solari administration's representatives made claims about the original compact's provisions that were incorrect and needed to be corrected by someone who had read the document in its original form and could say so with formal authority. He was a delivery worker who showed up, read what needed reading, and went back to work. That was the thing he kept coming back to. The Keth-Solari administration had decided, at some point in the last several hundred years, that humans were most useful as labor units. That the capacity humans had, the one the Veth-Karen researchers had documented, the one that let humans process the founding language's resonance architecture, was less valuable than human physical capacity to load and carry and operate equipment. And maybe that decision had made sense at the time, or maybe it had been deliberate suppression, or maybe, this was Camille's theory, the one she was building documentation for, it had been neither, but rather the particular kind of institutional inertia that happened when a system became too large to see itself clearly and too profitable to have any incentive to look. The humans hadn't known. They'd been recruited from Earth under labor migration agreements that described Solaris stations' working conditions in careful, accurate, non-deceptive terms, and said nothing about the station's founding documents, because the recruits hadn't known to ask, and the recruiters hadn't volunteered. 43 people who had come here carrying things for a living, and who could, it turned out, read the oldest records in this sector of space. He thought about that a lot on the routes. He thought about it during the toss-in catch, the fastener arcing in the corridor light, his hand finding it on instinct. He thought about what it meant that a capacity could be real and present and go entirely unused, not through failure of the person carrying it, but through the failure of the systems around them to imagine it might be there. A Keth-Solari overseer watched him toss the fastener one afternoon on the lower deck loading bay and said something his translator implant gave him as, "Is that a labor efficiency technique?" He thought about it, more of a thinking technique, he said. The overseer's sensor array processed this. Then, what are you thinking about? Routes, he said, which was true. Camille's theory was correct, or correct enough that the distinction didn't matter practically. The Keth-Solari administration had not actively suppressed the human cognitive-linguistic connection to the founding language. They had simply never investigated it, because investigating it would have required someone to commission the research, and commissioning the research would have required someone to wonder if it was worth commissioning, and wondering that would have required someone to consider the possibility that the humans they'd recruited as labor might be more than what the labor contracts said they were. It was not malice. It was the shape that organizations took when they got large enough to stop seeing the individuals inside them. This was, as Camille noted in her documentation, not a mitigating factor for the compact violations, but it was a relevant context for the renegotiation. You couldn't renegotiate with a system that understood itself as malicious. You could renegotiate with a system that understood itself as having made an error, because systems that understood themselves as error-prone could also understand themselves as capable of correction. The renegotiation produced 4 new labor provisions: a formalized recognition of human founding language capacity in the station's administrative records, a review process for the original labor migration recruitment terms, and this was the one that Darren had not expected, a new classification in the station's roll registry. The classification was called Resonance Attester. The description in the registry, rendered in standard compact administrative language, was specialist worker possessing verified cognitive capacity for founding language comprehension and authorized to provide formal attestation of Veth Karen archival records. He was listed as the first one. His name in the registry was in standard script, and next to it, in a smaller notation that Camille had insisted be included, was his founding language resonance designation. The carrier, the one who moves things between places. He kept his delivery route. He hadn't been asked to give it up, and he hadn't offered. 3 days a week he ran filtration components and medical supplies and mechanical parts through the corridors of Solaris Station, from the loading bays to the service lifts to the transition viaduct and back, with the fastener in his pocket and the particular quiet of someone who knew where they were going. 2 days a week, he was in the archive corridor on the Spire District's maintenance access border, working through the Veth Karen records with the archivist. The archivist's communication had improved, not in the sense of better translation. Neither of them used translators when they were working, because the founding language was more precise than any translated overlay, but in the sense of two beings getting used to each other's ways of thinking. The archivist thought in enormous structural spans, the way old buildings were thought about, the whole geometry first, then the details within it. Darren thought in roots, in connections, in what went from here to there and why, and what happened when it arrived. They were, it turned out, complementary. The archivist could see what the records said in the large sense. Darren could see what moved through them, what the founding compact had been designed to carry forward, not just in legal provisions but in intent. The archivist had been waiting, he understood now, not for a legal expert and not for an academic but for exactly this. Someone who understood transit, who knew what it felt like to carry a thing from one place to another and why that mattered. The first archive panel they translated together and formally presented to the Labor Board contained the founding compact's original definition of the word station asterisk, which in the founding language was not a place but a relationship, a point where things in transit paused, exchanged what they were carrying and continued. Not a destination, a moment of transfer. He had spent 18 months on Solaris Station treating it as a destination, as a place where he'd ended up. He thought now it might have always been a moment of transfer. He just needed to understand what he was carrying and what he was supposed to exchange it for. On the last day of the renegotiation's formal proceedings, Camille brought a bottle. Darren had no idea where she'd gotten a bottle on sub-level 9, but in 4 years she had learned things he was still learning, so he didn't ask. They were in the maintenance alcove, 6 of them. Darren, Camille, Os, Pelek, and 2 other humans from the labor contingent who had turned out in the months since the hearing to have varying degrees of founding language sensitivity, not as complete as Darren's and Camille's, but real. One of them was a woman named Farida who had been doing route logistics for 2 years and who, when she'd first sat in the archive corridor and felt the resonance, had said, with complete composure, "I thought I was losing my mind." I thought everyone felt that. The other was a man named Cal who had been doing maintenance work, and who had no patience for the political dimensions of any of it, but a deep and genuine fascination for the archive records themselves, and who in 3 months had become the most technically proficient reader among them. Camille poured into whatever containers were available. The alcove ductwork hummed. Somewhere on the station's working level, a loading cycle was completing, the clang of it familiar and almost comfortable. "What does it say?" Farida asked, "in the founding compact about what comes next?" He thought about the relevant section. He had read it enough times now that he didn't have to think hard. "It says the compact renews when all its signatories are present at the table." "Are we at the table?" "Not yet," Camille said, "but we're at the station." He thought about that. Thought about the word asterisk station and its founding language resonance, the pause in transit, the moment of exchange. He thought about a sphere pulsing in the dark under a bunk, patient as anything. He thought about 43 humans who had come here carrying things and found out there was something else they could carry, something older and heavier and worth the weight. He picked up the fastener from his pocket one more time, tossed it up. The alcove light caught it at the apex, a brief, bright triangular flash, and it came back down into his hand, warm from being carried all day. He held it still. "We'll get there," he said. And they would, he knew the route.